Hello and welcome. My name's Dawn Vanderstoop. I'm an artist, and today I'm going to share with you how I mount my black PanPastel pieces with the gold mixed media to these wood cradle boards. And these are rare in the case that they're black PanPastel and it's a lot like charcoal, so they can be sealed without it changing the look of the art. If I was creating a full color piece with whites and light colors, sealing it would drastically change the piece, and so I would protect those behind glass. But that's why I've been having so much fun with this mixed media projects, is that these can be mounted and they have the gold, and it's just been a lot of fun to create. So I have one piece here that needs to be mounted, and this is an example of what it'll look like in the end. So what we're going to do is when you have your finished piece, I usually will seal the finished piece, the black, before I put the gold on with a workable fixative, just to kind of protect it to it, because I know I'm going to mount it. If I was just working with a black PanPastel and I wasn't going to mount it, or I was just going to frame it, I wouldn't need to necessarily use the fixative, because the paper really grips the black PanPastel really well. So I have this, it's got the gold on it. I'm going to also be sharing with you how I seal these pieces so they're ready to hang. And what you're going to need is, this has been created on the Canson extra large mixed media paper, and it's a heavier duty, it's a 98 pound. And so that has allowed me to have something substantial to work with. They're wood panel, they're unprimed, and they just work great. So I've used these for prints. I've used these for when I did watercolor. I would mount my watercolors on here, and then I would seal them with a wax finish. This is Grafix double-sided. It's a double tack adhesive. It has a piece of protector on both sides, but the center is the double tack. It's acid-free. I get it from blickart.com. And you can sometimes find it on Amazon, but this is basically the crown jewel of the whole project. So I will mount this always to the wood first. And then once that's trimmed out, then I'm going to mount my art to the piece. And when I do that, I basically make sure your art is in a safe spot away. So you don't want that to get stuck to your art, because that would be really frustrating. So I always cut out a little bit extra so I have enough room to trim. I will always, on this process especially, use a fresh blade. That is really important. And when you peel this, it will come off with a curly end, and usually the part that's stuck will be flat. So that really helps with stability. So when I'm peeling that off, I will save this and I'll use that to help me protect my piece. And then I'll put this long ways, just because I know it's going to go easier that way. And I will touch down the first edges first, so it's not all the way flat. And then I'm holding it down with my fingers, and I will plop it down. Push it, and then flip it over. I'm going to smooth that out with my hands first. Have any bubbles, if there's anything, if you feel anything stuck on there, you can peel it off and fix it. It's totally workable that way. This brayer has helped me a ton. I'm gonna brayer this down. And then I'm gonna flip this over, and this is the part that you have to get used to. I mean, I've done hundreds of these, so it's like doing it in my sleep now. But you want to angle your X-Acto knife down on this edge here, and you start to get the feel for it, and you rest it and lean it against until you put some pressure on it when you're going down. So that's going to give you a really clean cut. You don't want a jagged cut, or stop and go, because that'll create a uneven cut, and that can be really frustrating when you're mounting a piece of art. So you just start to get the feel of it. I mean, if you can practice on some scrap, that would be great. I have definitely had some pieces where I've had to play around with the X-Acto knife to try to get the edges really smooth. So this just peels right off. And you can check to see how you did around the edges, see how that feels. I will make sure this sticky part is away. I will stick it on something because I don't want it to get stuck on my art. So now that I have this all done, the biggest, most stressor of the whole thing is you've got this, you know, original piece that you've spent a lot of time on, and now you got to get it on here. And a lot of people can be really stressed about that. So what I would do is I evaluate and assess, and I go, okay, well, do I have much hangover? How does that feel? Looks like I have about a 1/16 of an inch hangover on this. I also have to pay attention that this needs to be really centered because it's a solid edge, and you're going to see if that is not centered. So I think what I'm going to do is really focus on having it centered on this bottom part. So that's going to be the part that I want to work on first. And so I'm going to hold it up here and show you how little I have to work with. And this is kind of normal for me because I don't get stressed out with having to work with such a little bit amount. But if normally I would have a bleed, I'd have more than a 1/16 of an inch, I'd have a 1/4 of an inch or more to kind of play with. But on some pieces, I have to cut it pretty close. So I'm figuring out what edge I want to go with, and I want to go with this bottom edge. And I'm going to take the Tack adhesive and pull up from this one corner. So sometimes the actual tack will pull up and you have to push it back down and rub it and get it really stuck, and then try to pull it up again. And we're just going to pull up a small amount so we're not too stressed out and have to, you know, commit too much. I learned this the hard way. And you want to give yourself a little bit of a tab that you can grab with your fingers. And then I'm going to lay it over. I've done this enough where that I know that paper is keeping my art up from the sticky part. It won't go down until I push it down. And I am holding onto the art. If you can't hold onto your art because it, you know, isn't sealed enough yet, then I would probably seal your piece a little bit before going to this step. So now that I have it centered and I'm feeling pretty confident about it, I'm leaning on and I'm putting pressure to hold it stable. And then what I'm going to do is take this glassine, and glassine is what I use to protect a lot of my pastel pieces. And it's good to have that to be able to push down the piece in the end. So we're going to, once I feel really confident here, and I'm making slight adjustments, this is pretty detail oriented, then I'm going to put on that glassine and I'm going to commit. And so I've pushed down the center there. I've committed to it sticking onto the adhesive. And now I'm going to be able to reach under and pull that adhesive strip off the piece. So I'm going to tilt it here so you can see what that looks like. And it looks like all my edges are covered. I'm checking everything, making sure that no edges are off. It would be really hard to change my mind at this point, but I have been able to create miracles. So I'm reaching underneath, getting that tab. Now you can see it here. And I'm going to slowly pull that tab down away from the piece with my other hand on top with the glassine. And I go into the middle of the piece and inch down, and this will create an even bond without it wrinkling. And I will push out because it's really important for air bubbles in anything. So you want to push out onto that. And then I'll take the brayer and I'm going to commit it because I know that the edges are all covered, and I'm going to brayer all the edges down for the piece. Now that I have that done, I'm going to see on my glassine that some of that transferred. I will just take a little bit of a towel and wipe that off in case I want to use it again. And that allows me to reuse the glassine so it's not ruined. So now you can see that the edges, there's a little tiny bit left over. And I try to have that left over on all the edges so I could get that really clean, finished look. I'm going to set that down back on my glassine to protect the artwork underneath since it's not fully sealed. And I'm going to just use that so I can cut on, and the glassine will be used and cut up, but it'll protect my art. So at this stage, you want to be able to use thinner paper when you deal with this process, because if you have to cut through thicker paper, it can be really challenging. And you always want to line up your blade and do this in the stages so you're making this cut your final cut. And you don't want to dig into the wood. So if you're digging into the wood, that's telling you your blade isn't angled enough. So I went down twice on this one. I was having a hard time starting with the top part because I'm trying to video it, of course. And then I'm just going to go down each edge and twist that glassine around so I'm not having to mess up the artwork underneath. And after time, you'll get used to the feeling that you need to be where that blade is. And if you're ever having a big struggle, change your blade, because the blade is usually causes most of my problems. So now I'm going to peel off all of the extra. And we now have all of our clean edges look really good. And I'm realizing that I did not paint the edges with the gold. And I normally do that. But since I have it gold all the way around, that's not going to be a problem. So if you want to paint your edging first, that's what I would do for these pieces. Or I've sometimes had to make a little rough gold edge if I have to paint it second. So it allows you to just have a full clean edge if you paint it first. So I'm going to go and paint this and then be back to show you how I seal it. Okay, welcome back. I have cleaned up the gold and got all the edges done. So we are ready for the final seal. I did go out and do, because I can't really show that on camera, I did the seal for the first stage, and I have found this low odor clear finish works real well, but you have to, it says it's matte. I tried to find gloss and I thought I got a gloss, but it actually works just fine because a lot of times matte will dull down the gold. This did not, I guess because it's a clear finish, it does not dull down the gold. So that's the biggest challenge, is you have to use different sealers when you're working with gold. And the gold is what, like if I'm doing foiling, I have to use a foil sealer. If I'm, and I'd have to do it in different stages. So this is not a all for one steps. So it depends what you're working with. I have found that Krylon low odor clear finish is working for this stage. So I stood pretty far away and tried to do sprays, and it is not picking up as easy. So that's a good sign. If I rubbed on it, it probably would. Now I was using just a workable fixative, and that was picking up when I was sealing. So I'm getting a lot less of that now. So for the final seal, I'm using a soft gel gloss by Golden. Now this, if I use it without watering it down, it can be pretty thick and it will leave a shine. And I wasn't as much into the gloss, high gloss shine for this. I really end up, I prefer matte. So I took this jar, I have it with a little plastic on it so I can open and close it easily. And I have watered this down so it isn't as thick. So you can see it's pretty liquidy, but not like full on water, but it's definitely not as thick as what's in the jar. So this I have to do a couple of coats on. I have used it on this, and this is what you get for a finish. It's definitely not super shiny. It's more like a satin, and I've really enjoyed that. The tips for doing this, once you have it, hopefully you've put a couple coats of this on first or found something that works for you. And you will always start with the brightest spots first because there is so much black pan pastel in here. And yeah, it's supposedly sealed, but there's probably still going to be a little bit that shows through. So I'm going to dip my brush. If you let this also sit overnight and stuff, it gets rid of the air bubbles from stirring it. So I don't overload my brush, and I'm going to go down and do the whites first. And I'm going to brush off my brush to see, is that picking up anything? And it doesn't look like it is, so that's a good sign. What it'll do is it'll put a little bit of black lines in the piece. So I'm going to go and try to cover just be really aware. I've had some pieces that have gotten black lines in them, and I've had to be really creative on getting them out. So you definitely want to go over it and make sure there's no heavy lines and feather that out. So now I feel pretty good that the main part is covered, and I'm just going to go over the rest of the front here. And you can see how thin this is not. See right there is something picked up. There's the black right there. I'm going to rub that off. So once it gets wet, you're going over those pieces first to dry. So it dries pretty fast. So that has been the biggest challenge on this, is trying to find, because pastel necessarily isn't the, you know, I don't seal anything but the black pastel. I've thought of throwing like maybe a red color in there or something like that, but when you start getting into highlights and whites, it will knock that down and muddy it, and you can't seal on a sanded paper. This is mixed media paper. So just going through and getting this all sealed. So once this dries, I will put on a couple coats. Okay, so that coat's pretty dry, and I'm going to go do a second coat. And now I can be a little bit freer because those parts are sealed underneath. And now I'm just trying to even out the brush strokes, and thinning it down with water does help it have a smoother brush stroke. If you use this soft gel gloss with a thicker application, you would have a lot more shine and a lot more brush strokes. Okay, here we are. We've put down the 3 layers of the soft gel gloss that I've watered down, and now it is all dry. And make sure when you're doing these layers to double check for any air bubbles. Sometimes they will bubble up and you almost can miss it. So I just push those down with my finger and then brush over them, and then double check to make sure there's none, because once it dries, it'll stay there permanently. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial today on mounting your art piece. And if you're curious and want to learn more of how to create a piece like this, I have a class called Simply Magic on my website. And I want to thank you very much for joining me here today, and take care.